raising money will become even more important than before if that is possible, which is absolutely bonkers. The fiercer the competition, the more the money becomes a discriminating factor, a differentiator. And so it may be that raising money will become even more important than before if that is possible, which is absolutely bonkers.
Welcome to Blitzscaling, a startup. I'm Julien Newman.
And I'm Chris Ye.
And Chris, we have a very exciting topic today and a very exciting sponsor for our episode / topic. And I know you were really excited about this topic as well.
Yeah, no, this is, well, we haven't revealed the topic yet, but I can say it's a topic I'm very excited about because it's something that seemed impossible not that long ago, but has now become something that is quite possibly a reality. And it's going to really lead to some interesting goings on in the world.
So the topic is essentially, like, I think the kind of like term, and people see it in the title, but it's like a 3-person unicorn or 3-person billion-dollar startup. And really what that is like, can you get away with building at least some companies with a, ridiculously lean team? So essentially, like, if you're 3 people, let's call it 5 people, like it's like founders plus a couple of people maybe. And like, can you get to being, I guess, like, can you get like a huge like market leadership position with that few people? And like, is that now possible in a way that it wasn't before?
Yes. So I think that, this is something where a number of people have talked about it. And I think there's some relatively famous people who've advocated for this. And the reason it's possible now, and it wasn't before, is because of artificial intelligence. If you think about AI, what AI does is it amplifies human intelligence. It amplifies human productivity. I often cite the statistic that in the British Industrial Revolution, the textile industry's labor factor productivity increased by a factor of 40, which is pretty amazing. And there was also a study that came out recently that said for contract review, the labor productivity increase for an attorney, because they allow AI to do most of the work, was about 300x. So that's pretty remarkable. Well, if we start to think about the size of a company that's worth $1 billion, we haven't seen a 3-person startup be worth $1 billion before, but we've certainly seen like a 120-person startup be worth $1 billion. In fact, a company like OpenAI has I think 500 employees or so, and is worth $100 billion. So that's a clear indication that you can do so. But with AI, it may be that you can take those numbers of 500 or 100 or what have you, and cut them again by a factor of 40 or even 300. You can imagine a 3-person team doing the work of 1,200 people. Now, the reason why we're not talking about a solo company, a solo unicorn, is because it's very difficult for one person to have all the requisite skills to cover all the functions within a startup. But it's quite possible with 3 people to cover off nearly all those functions, whether it is marketing, sales, engineering, operations, customer service, and so on and so forth, because you have 3 people with very different skills. I don't want 3 founders who are identical. That doesn't make much sense. But 3 founders with complementary skills could very well run a unicorn company.
So I actually, this is something like our conversations have really fed into my thinking about this, and this is, I think, my goal. And one of the ways that I have been working towards this goal is I've been selecting a technology stack for my product that is, let's say, optimized for giving maximum leverage to a few people. So an example of that is I'm building an app, and I'm building it using a framework called Flutter that enables you to, that's like really easy to set up, and developers don't really like it that much, but non-developers, it makes it a lot easier for non-developers to build. And it's anyways, but I specifically picked it for kind of like, it makes things easier, and I picked everything in a way that makes things easier. And one of the decisions that I made was, because the app I'm building now is a messaging app, is to use this software development kit called Stream. And I actually reached out to the Stream team to see if they would sponsor our episode, which they have. And so I am going to read Stream's little blurb here.
Oh,
so the blurb is,
could you put the blurb? Could you put the blurb up on the screen so I could do it? I've always wanted to do a live read on a podcast.
Oh my God! All right. Let's.
I've not had a chance to do this before. I love, for example, the live reads that Conan O'Brien does on his podcast. I don't think I can possibly do it as well as he does, but it would really mean a lot to me to do the live read.
Do you see it here?
I don't see it yet. Is it in the chat? Let's see. Yeah, I see it. Yes, I've got it. I've got it. Perfect. Oh, I'm so excited. I've never had a chance to do this before. All right, here we go. This podcast is sponsored by Stream. Stream helps developers build engaging apps that scale to millions with performant and flexible chat, video, voice, feed APIs, and SDKs. It's really smart for them to focus on the messaging portions of it. I mean, it really makes a lot of sense. Instead of a general purpose framework, you really have one thing you do super duper well. All right, get up and running in just a few lines of code, allowing you to focus on crafting exceptional user engagement experiences. Oh, that's really cool. Well, what's it been like using Stream?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So there's this a young developer who's been helping me, and he actually had used Stream so he's the one who recommended Stream because he'd used it before. So it is a pretty popular framework or tool, and it's made my life a lot easier. And I think really, like, in the past, I've done software development. I haven't written a line of code in like 5 years, but I've never done any mobile development. I've never done, like, I submitted an app to the App Store for the first time. I had never done any messaging, anything. And I was able to get this app up and running. I mean, I had to debug it. It took me a lot longer to debug the app than to build it. It took me 3 weeks to build it.
Well, those bugs were your fault, not Stream's fault, clearly.
Yeah, yes. So I had to get people test it, whatever. And then who knows how I think it'll take more time to get it approved by the Apple App Store than to build it. And it's 100% because I used the Stream SDK. Not only the Stream SDK, right? So I use like a Firebase for notifications. I use, essentially Google Cloud for your backend. I use Flutter, which makes the kind of like building the app a lot easier, and building in both iOS and Android, and also web and whatever. So I have been really surprised as someone who has not done that much software development in the last couple of years, at how much easier it is to just build stuff now, and also how much easier it is to learn how to use new tools, right? So like, I don't know how to do anything in Flutter, and or using Stream or anything. And what I do is I just go see like ChatGPT, or right now I'm using something called Claude that I find works better. They have like a new version of it. And I say, like, Claude, how do I do this?
Is Claude from Google, I think? Is that right? Or no?
No, it's Anthropic.
Oh, Anthropic. That's right. Yes. Okay. I have a hard time keeping track of these because they have these terrible names that make no sense.
Yes. But yeah, so I've been, so if you remember, Chris, we've been talking a lot about like location, like where should I be located? And, this stuff matters so much. It's like, okay, should I be located somewhere where I can do, really optimal hiring, right? And actually, the hiring, like the way you think about hiring, is totally different if you're only ever going to hire like 2 people or 3 people or 4 people. And then it's like, well, how do I think about cost of living, right? So one of my big concerns with being in, Silicon Valley proper is like, well, rent's like 3-4K. Like that's insane. But if it's 3-4K for 3 people, I mean, it doesn't matter, right? And that like so actually I can reveal to you that now my plan has changed and I am planning to move right near where you live. So
So
because of this.
you're not going to be moving to SLO. You're going to be moving up to the Bay Area.
Yeah, that's my current plan.
Great. That's even
my
better for
Florida
me.
action. Yeah. So it's a like I guess the overall point here is I believe like I kind of had this hypothesis. I was like, does this work? I didn't actually believe that you could do so much as an individual now. And I was like, maybe you can, right? And I was talking to my wife about this like 6 months ago, and I was like, well, let's try it, right? And I actually tried using the different like low code and no code and whatever, and I've been able to using ChatGPT, but also using all these platforms that kind of like out of the box, kind of it's like buy don't build platforms. They really do work really well. Like Figma makes design. I didn't know how to do graphic design at all a year ago, and I kind of like learned it. It's so easy using Figma. Like everything is so much easier than 10 years ago, at least. And you've really gotta like the cost of having a lot of people and of spending all your like of managing them and thinking about systems for them and recruiting them and whatever it is so high that if you can get away with having a really small team, it seems like a no-brainer.
Yeah. Well, this is fascinating because my mind is absolutely spinning with ideas, primarily because I do think it's possible, and I think that what's really interesting is the unintended consequences or the implications that most people don't think about. I'll give you an example. If we think back to the Web 2.0 revolution, which is one of the technology booms I lived through, the key there was the technology, but the underappreciated element of the technology was the rise of things like Amazon Web Services. So historically, this may sound insane to people who are not old like me. If we went back to the dot-com boom, when I started my first company, if you wanted to create a web application and make it available to people, you had to build out your own data center space. So you would rent the racks at a place like Exodus or Global Center, companies that no longer exist. You would sign a contract that required you to pay $20,000 a month for this space. You'd then turn around and you would buy servers, and these servers would cost many thousands of dollars. And so in order for a startup to even exist, you would have to raise money from investors, right? And people would raise a seed round and then a Series A. Those rounds were smaller, of course, but you couldn't even get to market without raising money because it was simply impossible to actually get enough resources to launch something. And then along came things like Amazon Web Services and other managed service providers and hosts and things like that. And all of a sudden, those costs had declined by orders of magnitude. And this was super exciting for all of us at the time. Like anybody who can remember spending $20,000 a month to run a website would be like, oh my gosh, it's so much easier to do this than before.
Well, the other thing is, right, like you essentially, like if you start a startup that's like, legit and you have like, you have like, blessing of VCs or whatever, you don't actually have to raise from them. AWS will give you like $1 million of credits.
That's right.
And then, well, I'm doing this now. I'm on the maker plan of Stream. I'm not paying a dime. I'm on the Blaze plan or whatever, Firebase. I'm not paying a dime. Like I'm paying, like I have a functional product, and I'm not going to have to pay. Like the most expensive thing for me is buying my domain. Like that is my number one expense, and it's $15.
That's astonishing. Now, but what are the implications of this, right? So and that's why I'm looking back to the Web 2.0 boom, because I'm trying to figure out what are things that happen. Well, at the time, what we would say is, well, it's obvious, people are going to start more companies. and they're going to be able to get further before they raise money from investors. These all seem like good things, and they are, right? The number of applications, websites, services, and things like that, so much higher than they were during the dot-com era, because we no longer have the capital constraint that forced people to do this. But, and this is a big but, this does not mean that it is easy to succeed, right? It is not the case that, oh, from the dot-com era to the Web 2.0 era, all of a sudden, it became easy to be an entrepreneur and be successful and make millions of dollars. Because the fact is, it's a competition. And so during the dot-com era, you had to raise money in order to do this. But once you had raised money, you were facing many fewer competitors because you had to raise money just in order to exist, just in order to reach the market. And by the time Web 2.0 rolled around, it was very different. People were, creating all of these different companies, but they had to stand out from the competition. And so it increases the competitive dynamic. It makes it ever more important to find a way to stand out in the marketplace and to break through.
I assume it also changed who could start a business. So let's say, Mark Zuckerberg is kind of like the, Web 2.0 entrepreneur. And like, if he had needed to, before starting Facebook, raise $50 million or whatever.
Never could have done it.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we see, in the Web 2.0 era, folks where, do they necessarily have a traditional background running these companies? No. We have, for example, here's a great example. There are iconic companies that were during the Web 2.0 era that were very small as well, at least at the outset. So, for example, Instagram, a company that had, half dozen people essentially when it was acquired, because it had hired like 6 people in the previous week, but they ran the company with 6 people. Or a company that is still so important today is Automatic, which runs WordPress. Automatic is named after its founder, Matt Mullenweg, who was 17 when he created the WordPress software and was operating by himself. Today, of course, they have a massive company. And so, being able to start a company meant that there was much more competition, meant that all of a sudden investors went from backing people with a PowerPoint to backing people who were actually in the market. In some ways, this made becoming an investor more attractive. And there are many more venture capital funds today than there were back then as well. So you wouldn't have necessarily guessed the implication would be there would be more investors. But perhaps that's one of the sort of things that will happen. But wait, there's more. Right? Thinking about the implications, during the Web 2.0 era, that was basically hand in hand with what we can describe as the SaaS era of enterprise software. Enterprise software went from being this on-premise stuff that was licensed in terms of CPUs and servers into a per-seat model. Right? It no longer made sense to license per CPUs when people were just getting their compute from AWS anyways. And so we've entered into this era where software is typically paid on a per-seat basis. Well, think about it. If more and more companies are going to exist, and more of those companies will have 2 or 3 people, the traditional SaaS model of per-seat pricing may no longer make sense either, because part of the thesis behind SaaS is land and expand. We're going to get people to very easily adopt this product, and eventually more and more people in the company will use it, and we'll go from a freemium product to 1 license to 1,000 licenses over time. If the companies are going to stay like 3-person companies, does that make any sense? And if you want to stick with that kind of per-seat pricing, you're going to have to be pushed towards being an SMB product, or a prosumer product, as opposed to a traditional enterprise product. The idea of land and expand will simply go away, at least for this new wave of companies. So there are all these implications that, again, if you just say, oh, 3-person unicorn sounds cool, but it actually means that there's going to be change throughout the entire ecosystem.
Yeah, and 2 things I've been thinking about that you touched on is like the profile of founders and then the profile of investors. And it seems to me that like there's a certain type of person who is very successful in let's say the last 5 years, right? Just pretty much somebody who's Facebook employee or a like a McKinsey person, like who's set strategy, is really good at recruiting, it's storytelling, blah, blah, blah. And like even the kind of like CTOs, they're mostly recruiting and managing and stuff like that. If you have 3 people, right? And it's not even like 3 people. Let's say it's even 10 people, right? I mean, your capacity to just be like an amazing recruiter matters so much less when you're like for the foreseeable future, you only have to hire a couple, like 5 people, right? And then the other one from a venture capital perspective is like, so I'm not sure to what extent any of this is like truly that much more capital efficient because let's say stream, like I'm paying nothing get off the ground, or like if you use AWS, you're paying nothing get off the ground, but then you like rack up fees, and like if you try and keep your team lean, like you're okay with paying those fees even though it's not capital efficient. So maybe you'll end up raising more capital than it looked like, but you'd assume that you'd end up raising less capital, right? And if you go to a model where, let's say, you could be a team of 3 people, and you could get the $1 billion valuation, and you could like forever raise, let's say 10 million, 20 million, like something small, right? I mean, it's not small, but it's like compared to what?
Smaller, yes.
Yeah. What matters? Like essentially, I guess my point is the VCs become people that you recruit as team members more than capital partners or financial partners, right? So let's say I go see you, I'd say, Chris, we're only 3 people. If you're on my board or you're invested here, you're actually a big part of our team. So I really care about who you are. And yeah, you're going to give me some money and I need that money, but I don't need that much money. So you're primarily bringing your expertise. You're primarily bringing your contribution. So it feels like you'd have, let's say, like better better terms for less money for higher quality partners, rather than ridiculous valuations with like rando 12-year-olds who graduated from Stanford giving you $100 million, which has been the case the last 5 years.
Yeah, and if you start to think about it, I mean, what does this mean for the venture capital industry? There will be an entire class of companies where the traditional reason why venture capital has been able to make so much money is because they can get significant ownership in companies. Well, if a 3-person company can be a unicorn, if they can do so with very little money, I mean, if you're a founder, will you decide that you want to take venture capital money or not? Will more people choose to go the path of bootstrapping rather than raising money? Or maybe because there are so many more people, you want to really stand out, and raising money becomes one of the most important ways that you can stand out. And more companies are competing in the marketplace for attention and need to spend more and more of their money on marketing, and perhaps raising money becomes even more important, right? This is one of those things where I can see an argument for it going either way, and that's what makes it so exciting. The obvious conclusion of, well, venture capital is doomed is probably incorrect. The fiercer the competition, the more the money becomes a discriminating factor, a differentiator. And so it may be that raising money will become even more important than before, if that is possible, which is absolutely bonkers when you think about it, because we normally think about venture capital as, we have to pay for all these people, but once we don't have to pay for people, we won't need venture capital. In fact, once people are no longer the differentiating factor, you have to pay far more for those other things, which cost money.
Yeah, so the kind of, like, the way I'm thinking about what you said is, if you're not getting leverage through people, then where are you getting the leverage, right? And you're getting the leverage obviously through decision making, which is like quality of people, right? You're getting leverage by like outsourcing to computers, right?
Yep.
So outsourcing work to various types of computers. Presumably, you're getting leverage through being really good at learning, right? So you have like, let's say 3-4 people, and you want to have like, let's say if I want to do SEO, I want to learn from like the best
Right.
SEO people. So having access to the best people, so like network gives you tremendous leverage.
Yeah.
And then, as you say, capital, it gives you tremendous leverage. So that is an interesting, so it's like, if you're not getting leverage through headcount, then all the other types of leverage
Exactly.
matter more.
So this is a classic principle, which is when the cost of one product dramatically declines, then the value of the complements to that
Yeah.
increases. And that's why, again, we often forget this and we just look at, well, what's the implication of the people cost going down? We don't think about the fact that everything else then potentially becomes more valuable. And I want to take this moment to really self-promote, because a couple of things you mentioned tie in directly with the kind of stuff that I work on. So, one thing, of course, I do is Blitzscaling Ventures and the whole principle of Blitzscaling. And what's interesting to me is thinking about, as the technologies become more and more available to build these companies, it becomes harder and harder to distinguish yourself purely on technology. And it means that the blitzscaling principles of driving network effects and building virality and all those things become ever more important. Rather than relying on technological differentiation, you have to rely more on business model differentiation. And so your strategy as a 3-person company becomes ever more important, because you can assume that each of these 3-person teams is going to have incredible people. And so the people are no longer the differentiator. And as we pointed out, the technology is probably no longer the differentiator. And therefore, the strategy becomes the differentiator.
Yeah.
So the strategy of blitzscaling potentially becomes even more important for these companies, which is fascinating. The second thing, go ahead. Let's talk about that. Then I've got another.
So there's something you said that really stood out to me, which is like, if you have 3 people, right? It really matters that those 3 people be of the highest quality possible.
Absolutely.
But you have to assume that everybody else, like a lot of other people, can get tremendously high quality 3-people team. Like
That's right.
It's hard to build a 100-person team of like the smartest people, but like it's not that hard to recruit 3 amazing people. Like that's totally doable. And that's such an interesting thing where it's like it becomes a necessary component to have like everybody be of the high, like you have like no room for error.
That's right.
But you're not getting an edge. While in the past you had room for error, and it, but also it would give you an edge as well. So it's like a different dynamic than how I thought about it.
Yeah, and you already see this at work in certain industries that have this structure. So venture capital is a great example.
Yeah.
Venture capital is an industry where typically a small team can actually manage a significant amount of money and accomplish a lot. And this is actually one of these things that philosophically, it's fascinating. It goes in waves. So venture capital was a cottage industry. And then the big change was when Andreessen Horowitz said, what if we built out this gigantic team, not the investment team, but the rest of the team, to offer these services to the startups as a way of attracting them in? Can we build a different kind of firm? And their success has led other firms to imitate them. And venture capital firms got bigger and bigger to provide all these shared services. But when all these shared services are provided by AI instead, does that model no longer make sense? Will we see a return to the traditional structure of venture capital, which is a small, relatively equal team? And certainly with Blitzscaling Ventures, we had always thought that we would probably remain small. But with the implications of AI, it probably dramatically increases the chances we do that. Because in order to be successful, raise more money, have a greater impact, you no longer need to build out this gigantic team.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Like, and I'm thinking so for you, right, as a VC, when you're evaluating a company, is something I noticed pitching VCs, just like, actually, you guys have no idea about anything.
Right.
Right? Like you talk to a couple of customers, you might meet, you meet the CEO, but you might meet the CTO, like, and like you don't know any of the other employees, blah, blah, blah. But if you have a really small team, right, you can actually get, like, when you're diligencing a company, you as a firm can actually get to know 100% of the team, right? So it's not like, hey, Julien is pitching this company and I like Julien. It's like, well, let me meet these two other people and see what they think and see how, where their vision is. Is it the same as Julien's? Like it feels like you could, and that's such a big part of de-risking the business, actually. So if you're able to talk to 100% of the team and like really go deep with 100% of the team, that to me would dramatically change the risk assessment, like the entire way that you think about businesses, about investing.
And you already hit upon one thing, and I want to use that as a jumping off point for a little bit of further self-promotion, which is, you mentioned, historically, we have this notion that one of the most important things that the CEO can do is recruit. It's like recruiting, the ability to tell the story, the ability to convince people on board. One famous example of this is, and his name, he shall remain nameless to protect him, because I don't care, but he might care and would want to keep this confidential. I remember I am friends with a venture capitalist, a very successful venture capitalist, who he and I talked about Uber, because he had actually backed Travis Kalanick's previous company. He said, Travis came in and pitched Uber, and we loved the idea, but we didn't invest because we didn't think that Travis could recruit great people to his company. We'd seen how he operated before, and we thought that there's no way people would work for this guy. And the difference was, of course, with Uber, it became so promising. The chances of making money became so impressive that people said, well, I don't care if the guy's kind of a jerk. He's a jerk who's going to make me rich. And the jerk who's going to make me rich is a theme that happens a lot in Silicon Valley. But that's an example of passing on a brilliant strategy, because the concern over recruiting overrode that. And in the future, recruiting no longer becomes the key focus. The focus becomes the strategy, but perhaps even more importantly, the focus becomes on the learning. And is the person an infinite learner? Trademark. Infinite learner, of course, is a concept from Blitzscaling that I expect will probably be the next book that Reed and I write, which talks about the... Talk. And I have a TEDx talk. If you look up Chris Ye, TEDx, you can find me on YouTube and watch that video. I've been told it's outstanding. But in terms of being an infinite learner, it's all about, does a person have the ability to unlearn the lessons of success? And if you think about it, there is no greater need for being an infinite learner than a 3-person unicorn. The 3-person unicorn, by definition, the thing that is not changing over time is the composition of the company, the people. So you can't bring in new ideas and new attitudes by bringing in new people, which is typically how we do it, right? Oh, let's get some fresh blood in here. Well, if there's never any new blood, the freshness has to come from the people who are already there. And if you're a 3-person unicorn, you've already been tremendously successful. It's going to be quite tempting as a founder to say, I am super duper wealthy. I am swimming in money. I did this all by myself with this small team. Nobody can teach me anything. And so a lot of those companies are eventually going to founder because the founders are unwilling to learn. They're like, I figured it out. I'm so smart. This is what made me successful. I'm going to keep doing it until it goes out of business. It's probably okay because they've already made enough money. They're just going to sit back and live a life of leisure. But the long-term success of a 3-person unicorn is dependent on those 3 people being infinite learners.
Well, infinite learners, and this is something I've been thinking about, and I'll tell you what I'm doing for it. I don't know if it's the right strategy, but it'll kind of like illustrate what I'm trying to say. Just, you have to be, as individuals, infinite learners, but also as a team, an infinite learner. So you have to like learn together. Yeah. So you need to have like tremendous cohesion in terms of everyone's thinking around things. Yeah. Because you can, right? So if you have a 50-person or 100-person company, you will have everyone thinking their own thing and going off in different directions, and it'll eventually all maybe go somewhere.
Right.
But if you have 3 people, you actually can think as a group,
Yes.
and therefore you need to. So here's the strategy I've been doing. So as you know, I often talk to people who are experts at various things to learn from them. So a recent conversation I had Wednesday, a couple of days ago, was with this guy Eduardo Burqueño, who you interviewed.
Yes, wonderful fellow.
So I reached out to him, and because what I wanted to learn about was what channels are working for him for go to market. And my theory is that because like books are kind of like projects, so like authors, they're kind of like projects exist in a moment in time. And like authors, because they have to like reinvent their go-to-market motion every book, like an author that just went into market would have insight into what's working, what's not, like what's underinvested in, and
Right.
like like people don't understand it's like good, and like that's where the edge is. So I'm trying to speak to like authors to understand like what channels is no one thinking about that they're not using enough. Anyway, so that's a conversation. And what I did is I invited this guy who's helping me build my product. I invited him to sit in with me, right? And the reality is, like, you know, there's something about being like the CEO where people will talk to you. Like, I don't know if Eduardo would talk to this other guy, right? But for some reason, like, people just really like giving advice to CEOs, right? And so, but what I can do is have the other team members kind of like shadow me. And then after you sit down, you're like, hey, what was the insight from that? What was the insight from that? And you kind of discuss it. So it's actually better for me because I get to, you know, to get other people's perspectives. And then what we did is we wrote up notes and sent them to Eduardo afterwards on, you know, our conversation afterwards. But it's like,
which of course is valuable to him as well.
Correct. But the point I'm trying to get across is that if you're a 3-person team, you actually can do the learning collaboratively. Like you can all be reading the same book, let's say. You can all be, and that feels like a really, like you could like over-index on that, but it does feel like something that'd be like more important in a small team versus in a 30-person team.
Right, and there's some fascinating implications that come out of that as well. So let's think about this. So if what's really critical in a small team is the way that small team works together, doesn't it make more sense for that team to be physically present in the same place?
Yeah.
Right. We have this notion of remote first, and let's gather people from all over the world. And maybe you can get the best people if you have a remote first organization, but that's just a temporary thing. If the key is working together on a day-to-day basis, it may very well be there will be a dramatic increase in the number of companies where all their people are in the same place, simply because there's so many fewer people. And because at that point in time, the cost of salary and paying people enough to live in a high-cost area becomes irrelevant. And maybe companies over time, you know, maybe they get started remote first just in order to save money. But as soon as they achieve any sort of scale, I would expect the founders would then get together and decide where they were going to live and go to that place.
So here's what I'm planning to do. And it's totally what you're saying. So it's like, I'm planning on staying where I am now for longer because it's cheap.
Right.
And then move.
And you're in Bangkok, right?
Yes. Yeah. I'm still in Bangkok. But then move to essentially around Sand Hill Road. So in like Sanford Hill or whatever. Part of the reason is that I really like the gym at the Rosewood, and you can get a membership there. But the
JCC that I go to is also a very nice gym.
Yeah, it's true. But I really like that gym, and my wife likes it. And she goes like every day. So anyways, that's one of the reasons. The other reason is actually the kind of residential real estate there is not that high because it's kind of like not that much of a nice area.
It's up in the hill. It's up in the hills, and it's not traditionally a huge residential area. Although there are, you get to Woodside and whatnot, it becomes more common.
Correct, but like there are areas that are like a bit more like it's like cheaper than like near the train.
Yeah.
And but the key thing is you're right beside the VCs.
Right.
So and if you say that capital matters more, and you know, and that the like who you partner with for your capital also matters more, then you would want to be in a place that's, you know, maximally enabling you to assemble to be in person, like be like super closely networked with the very best people, the best VCs, the best, you know, founders or whatever, team members, and be all in person and seeing each other and totally in sync. And so maybe what would happen, instead of like, I think everyone thinks that, you know, Silicon Valley is kind of dead and everything's kind of remote and whatever. And the opposite is true, where it's like, actually, it's no longer going to be like San Francisco, no, Silicon Valley, no. It'll just be like around the Stanford campus will be 100% of the,
right.
Like you have like an even smaller geographical footprint, or something like
that.
Yeah,
because it's a network, right? It's all about the network and the density of the network. And that is greatly ironic, right? That artificial intelligence and all these tools, the inventions of Silicon Valley, are going to serve to reinforce the dominance of Silicon Valley as a startup cluster. Because after all, the biggest objection to Silicon Valley as a startup cluster, nobody says, oh, you know, it's a bad place to start a company because there aren't enough people, or everyone just says, well, the cost of living is too high. Well, when the cost of living becomes irrelevant for companies for most of their life cycle, and it may very well be some companies will start elsewhere or start remote first, but more and more the successful companies will simply say, you know what, let's just go live in Silicon Valley. Let's just be there where everyone else is, where we can work with people in person, where we work with each other in person, where we can, you know, go up to the Rosewood and have a meeting while staring out over the sunset, or where we can go for a hike in the Stanford Dish and maybe run into some of the other business partners we have while we're there. And
I can run into you in the sauna.
You can run into me in the sauna. The sauna. Don't forget sauna, as our dear friend Ben Kaznelka would point out. So that is really funny, because we are now, again, the unintended consequence, the unanticipated implication is that this is going to make Silicon Valley come roaring back. And it already has come roaring back because of AI, because when you have something new, everyone needs to get together. But this means just more and more people will congregate here. Again, maybe people could try to argue, oh, can we build a cluster in Miami or something like that? And again, you might be able to do so by finding a specific niche. So it wouldn't surprise me if in the long run, Miami or maybe even Puerto Rico becomes a Web3 center, because you're able to get critical mass within one sector. But for the broad startup market, I think that this makes Silicon Valley even more appealing.
Okay, last question, which is, okay, so essentially what we're talking about is everyone's a founder, right? There's no non-founders. Everyone's a founder until you could be a public company. Doesn't mean that you will be, but you know, you're like solid enough that
there's certain kinds of companies where that will be harder, where you need a significant go-to-market operation, salespeople and customer success people. And even though AI will help them be more productive, there are just certain limitations. So it's only going to be some kinds of companies, but it's a lot more than before.
Yeah, well, and I would say even enterprise companies, like one of the things I noticed building 2 enterprise companies is like, at first, like essentially in my first business, everyone wanted to meet face to face. In my second business, everyone wanted to meet over Zoom. Towards the end of it, no one wanted to meet at all. And these are like, we were selling 100K deals, and like pretty much it was like, so it was like in person. So it's like, you know, you'd have like I'd always be at the clock tower. You know where that is in New York? It's like so like every day I'd be at the clock tower, and I'd have like breakfast there and lunch there, and I'd always be meeting people at the clock tower. So that was kind of like my core technology for meeting people, or it'd be in the subway, you go to people's offices. Then I was always in Zoom. By the end, I was always in Loom, which is this like async thing.
Right.
And that works so much better. So I do think it's like more companies than you would imagine, just because things are like enterprises don't want to talk to you anymore. But okay, the question is, if you are the type of company that can be really small, okay, who are those couple of people? And you touched on one element, which is like complementarity, right?
Yeah.
So like you don't want to be 3 hardcore developers, right? Yeah. Okay. But what else, right? Like, so let's say for me, right? I'm 35. I'm like pretty much a generalist at this point, or it's like I know how to build stuff. I also know how to sell. I know how to do like everything kind of, but not super well. And like if you want to hire people who are going to be the right people, so infinite learners, you want to have, so obviously you'd want to have people different perspectives, different backgrounds. Yeah. But like, so do you want to have people like, so like one question is, do you want to have people who are young because you think they will be able to continue to learn, while you assume that people who are in their 50s, for example, can't learn? Or would you want to have?
Yeah, so I think that the kinds of people that you're going to look for, not necessarily based on age, you look for people who are, as they say, T-shaped people. So T-shaped means that they have areas of deep expertise, but they have broad knowledge elsewhere, right? Somebody who's super duper siloed and insular, who is just a hardcore technologist, has no curiosity about the rest of the world, or is just hardcore sales and doesn't have any notion of how technology works, those people won't work in one of those 3-person companies. Those 3 people have to have a lot in common, have to be able to speak the same language, have to be able to work together. Because, all of a sudden, let's say you're the technologist, you won't have other technologists in the corporation to bounce ideas off of. But we don't like to make a decision purely by ourselves. We want to discuss it with somebody who's smart and interesting. So it will probably be the case that you want to discuss it with your fellow founders. By the way, there's another unanticipated implication, which is maybe it will become more and more important to have advisors to serve as the sounding boards for the 3 people in the unicorn. And those advisors will happily sign up because now all of a sudden, they're joining a unicorn. They have real value that's coming out of what they're getting. You could probably even pay them a great deal. I'm actually looking forward to this now. I suspect I will have an even more lucrative career, which is fantastic.
Yeah, well, there'll be a lot more equity to go around.
Yeah.
Right. Like if you're like the amount of equity that's required to incentivize employees is just.
Well, it's typically, you start with 20% when you form the company, you keep adding to it. And if instead you don't need to do that, well, that's way better. And as founders, you can all get enormously wealthy. Like if you own 1/3 of $1 billion company, that's pretty darn good. By the way, the other thing I would say is that this is a great development overall, because I've always said, and this is something that I've told many times about the power of startups. I said, what is more useful to society? What makes more progress? A 10,000 person company or 1,010 person companies? And it's clearly the 1,010 person companies. We're trying many more things. We're able to do so many more things. We're able to, capitalize on new things much better. And so if the structure of the startup world moves towards more and more of these really high-end 3-person companies, that means we're going to have many, many more companies, many more opportunities to create value. And I experienced this myself. When in the dot-com era, I created my first company. We began building it up and we hired out. And I think at our peak, we had 38 employees. And then after the dot-com bust, we had to lay people off and shrink the company down to basically 5 people. And I can tell you, I've often told people, it's astonishing. That was the golden age of our company, right? We had 5 people who were really dedicated, who could really work well together. And I tell people we could accomplish more with 5 people than we ever could with 38. Now, part of that was it was difficult during that era to hire great people. And some of the people that we hired weren't necessarily that great, but many of those people were actually quite talented and had a lot of capabilities. But even so, it was difficult to coordinate and make everything happen. And it's become so much easier to do that with that small team. So I think that this is great news for the startup world, for founders, for investors, for the world as a whole. There are going to be negatives, like nothing is an unalloyed positive, because I think that there will be companies that ultimately fail because they can't bring in fresh blood and they can't be infinite learners. And I do think that people are going to have to change the business model of things like SaaS. But I think overall, there's a better future waiting if we can build amazing products with fewer people.
Okay. As we leave, how important do you think this is? Like, let's say if you were going to say like the top 10 things that founders should be thinking of if they're starting a company today, would you rank this in the top 10? Would you rank it in the top 5? Like where would this rank?
Top 5, because founders are making decisions right now on who their co-founders are going to be, what their strategy is going to be, where they're going to be located. And if you believe, and you should do what Julien did, which was to experiment with tools like Stream, which allow you to have this kind of extreme productivity. If you do those experiments and it looks like it's going to work, then that completely changes your notion of how you're going to build your company. So of course, it is a top 5 concern. Once you have actually established yourself and you've built the team and you're set with that 3-person team, it's no longer something you think about all the time. But at the outset, for startups that are just getting underway, this is critical.
Yeah, I can say for my last business, probably the number one best decision we made was to be remote from day one.
Yeah.
And that is partially because everyone was forced to go remote later because of COVID, but also because it enabled us to operate in a manner that was so capital efficient, and to actually embrace the new, like we were a Zoom, like we did Zoom sales before, like when we started, people were like, they never used Zoom. The customers had never used Zoom. They were like just getting used to it.
Right.
But that gave us such an edge from a go-to-market perspective. Like everyone's learned this now, but it's like, I can do 100K deals over the phone now, over Zoom. And you're paying for some crazy flights and lunches and whatever. And it's giving you zero advantage.
Let me remind you, for the sake of any potential limited partners who are listening, that Blitzscaling Ventures does not pay crazy amounts for flights and meals and things like that. We get someone else to pay for that because I'm a world-class speaker and travel around the world getting paid to speak. But you're right, for a venture capitalist that was not in quite such high demand, yes, it would be a giant expenditure.
All right, Chris, I'll let you go. We're right on time. Thank you so much, for discussing this, and mostly thank you to everybody who listened in, and to Stream for sponsoring us.
I was going to say, we have to make sure we thank our sponsor Stream, which is helping make you productive, which is hopefully going to make the startup that you blitzscale like Instagram did, to reach $1 billion value with fewer than half a dozen people.